Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you online, and I welcome you all to the UKUPC ESG session brought to you by the Northwestern University's Purchasing Consortium. Our first speaker is Andrew Hewitt, the Director of Finance at the Manchester Metropolitan University, and Andrew is also the current chair of HEPA. We'll then hear from Smita Jamdar and Datta from Shakespeare Martineau. Please can you put any questions through the chat function and we will pick them up at the end of the session, and the session will also be recorded so we can get that to you afterwards. Can I ask that you all ensure that your mics and your cameras are turned off, and I'll now hand over to Andrew.
I think it is important to understand whether things are truly sustainable or not. That was followed in 1992 by a UN conference in Rio, which was called the Earth Summit. That led to the founding of Forest Stewardship Council, which I think was probably the first global certification scheme. In those days, the real issue was, or the perceived real issue was deforestation, particularly of tropical rainforests. FSC was set up to make sure that forests were properly managed. And it was quite interesting. I thought it was just about the timber, but there's a huge element in FSC about the social elements of people living and working in the forest as well. That's a well understood, well respected certification scheme. I think timber and paper products that have the FSC label on it are generally trustworthy, but I think the whole aim of it was to really slow down deforestation. It hasn't been effective in that regard. Then through the 1990s and 2000s, this is when I got involved working for a large corporate. The whole issue of CSR became quite mainstream. All the big corporates wanted to have their sustainability credentials recognised, and they'd have CSR strategies, and they'd start promoting them. Again, there is you need to read between the lines as to whether they are actually doing what they say they're doing generally. And then more recently, I think the first time I was able to come across ESG as a term, I think it was introduced in a paper by IFC back in 2004. It was really aimed at professional investment community. So in the past, investors have been focused very much on financial returns, but this paper was saying you need to be considering more than just financial returns. You need to look at the environmental issues within the business you're investing in, the social issues, and the governance within the business. So I think that's probably where the term ESG was coined. But all that is really what you probably recognise and been working on for some time as sustainable development. It might be a bit different around the edges, but basically this is all about sustainable procurement. So what does this mean for universities? So this is somebody else's slide. I thought it was really good. I saw this being presented by a firm called QMPF a couple of weeks ago. So I've borrowed it from them, but it summarises quite nicely many of the issues in a university for E, S and G. The areas I think procurement can contribute to very much on the environmental side. I think everything we buy has some sort of environmental footprint. If it's timber or pulp products, there's deforestation issues. Are you buying from sustainable sources? I think any product we buy, it's not just a matter of where the product comes from, but where it goes to once we've used it, and disposal. So the whole waste issue and waste streams of products going into waste, how do we manage those? Renewable energy, can we afford to buy renewable energy? There is more available, but it's expensive. Travel planning, I think all universities have travel policies, but how do we persuade people to use different modes of transport which have a smaller environmental footprint? Energy efficiency, we've probably all been investing that in some ways. Is there more we can do on that front? But I think overall, procurement has a big part to play in the environmental part of ESG. Also on the social side, although not in all those areas, I think certainly some of the bigger contracts we have at MMU, we're developing with our contractors to ensure that they're providing some training opportunities for our students. Working conditions and modern slavery issues, particularly important perhaps in some of, if you're subcontracting maybe cleaning services, there can be issues there. And certainly on the local community, there can be a really positive impact from procurement on the local community, working with local suppliers, trying to help them develop their businesses, working with local entrepreneurs, and really engaging with the area around your university. Then on the governance side, probably less for procurement to get involved with, but certainly bribery and corruption is an issue that we need to have. I think all universities have a bribery and corruption policy. So I think that's the kind of balance. You may want to debate some of these other issues. There might be ways that procurement can contribute to other areas, but I think the balance is very environmental, partly on the social and less on the governance side. But governance is hugely important anyway, and certainly the procurement processes need to have strong governance within them. Some of the challenges, I think, as I was certainly speaking as finance director, the cost of all these initiatives. Within Manchester, the city region of Manchester has a strategy to become carbon neutral by 2038. The university is aligned to that. We're planning to be carbon neutral before 2038. We reckon we could be carbon neutral by 2028, 10 years earlier, if we were willing to spend a lot of money on it. We could build our own wind turbines somewhere outside Manchester, maybe in North Wales or somewhere like that, feed the energy into the grid, take it out, use that energy to power our buildings, use that energy to through ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps to heat our buildings. If we could create our own sustainable source of electricity, that would remove a huge part of our carbon footprint. But it's a cost, it's a significant cost, and we're wanting to build new buildings, we want to invest in our student experience. How do we get that balance right between investing in mainstream university activity and the whole ESG agenda? So that's a challenge for all of us, particularly as we might expect something on the Augur report to come through from the government in the next few weeks, which might see our headline income reduce in some way. Next up, I've mentioned FSC, but there's lots of certification schemes out there. I've got FSC, Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. You probably recognise all those. And then Patagonia and M&S, two respected retail brands. But how much can you believe these people, or how much do they deliver what you actually want them to deliver? So I think retailer like Sainsbury's, I think, were big into fair trade a little while ago, and I think they've pulled out of fair trade because it didn't really give them the assurance they wanted. So yes, you can place some reliance on these labels, but can you place full reliance? Because, as I've said, there's plenty of greenwashing out there. You really need to understand what's going on. Don't just trust everybody. Don't believe what they tell you. Actually investigate it and look at it and make sure that you're comfortable with what they're doing. I like this one. You might feel like this sometimes. Lots of plate spinning. There's all the demands from all the different parts of the university. They're wanting their products and services. They're wanting to work hard on that. At the same time, we're throwing ESG into the mix. Can you keep all these plates spinning at once? We only have so many hours in the day. And finally, there's an interesting one, this one. You may be aware of the People and Planet University League table. It's a way all universities are assessed on their sustainability credentials. People and Planet assess universities, they come up, they award degrees. So what they believe to be the strongest universities, they'll give a first class honours degree to, then 2 1s, 2 2s, all the way down to a group of failed universities. And this one was interesting for me. Before I came to Manchester, I worked at the University of Dundee, ranked 134 on this league table. There are a few below University of Dundee as well. I wouldn't say they're bottom of the table, but People and Planet have them as a failed university. But at the same time, Times Higher had them ranked top. So who do you believe? It's the same university doing the same things. There's a different point of view. My view here is don't be pushed around by other people's view of what you're doing. Have your own plan, have your own strategy, and be true to your own values and work hard on that. And don't bother too much about what other people are thinking about you. So that's the introduction from me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the morning. And I think I'm now handing over, if I can close this down, to Smita.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm just going to get my slides up. So we're going to build on what Andrew has described by trying to explore how procurement particularly, but I think more generally higher education can adapt to the ESG environment. I think some of the balancing act, some of the challenges that Andrew described for procurement will only ever really be addressed if there's a coherent approach towards ESG throughout the university. And coherence is what we all crave, but it's not very difficult it's not very easy to achieve. So in our session, we're going to approach this from two very different perspectives, from the sort of very macro perspective, where I'm going to talk about how we might work towards embedding ESG in HE governance and the role that you could all play in helping that happen. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Datta, who's going to go to a much more micro level of looking at, specifically in relation to procurement, the what might we do differently through social value and so on to ensure that ESG is embedded in that process. So Andrew's already described what we mean by ESG, but I'm going to say a little bit about why I think it is important for it to be embedded in HE governance, and actually, to be honest, why I think HE governance is really geared up for it to be embedded, if it isn't already. I'm going to talk about the sort of relationship with existing governance expectations, how it can help manage legal and commercial risk, how it aligns with other sector initiatives that we know are going on, and finally, how we might make this happen. And then I'm going to hand over to Udi, and he will start talking more about the social value side of things. So in terms of what we mean by ESG, as Andrew said, it's obvious we're talking here about environmental, social and governance issues. And there are two ways of looking at this. The first is, what can we do ourselves to make sure that we are stimulating and promoting better environmental, social and corporate governance? But also, what can we as a university do to promote it in other people? And classically, ESG was, as Andrew said, it started out as something that investors were being asked to look at, to see how greater focus on the environmental, social and corporate governance performance of a target investment company could contribute to better returns and longer term sustainability. However, it's also clear that you can stimulate it not just through money you invest, but through the money you spend, i.e. procurement. And in my mind, it's also something that you can promote through the partnerships that you choose to engage in, which may be neither about investment nor procurement, but about creating something together. And there are a lot of stakeholders who are very, very interested in ESG. So students, as we know, if any of you have done any reading about what Generation Z is interested in, they are, almost it's hardwired into them to care about environmental, social, probably less so corporate governance at the age they're in, but it's similarly well-run businesses that are doing the right thing. Employment, for a lot of private businesses, certainly for businesses like ours, we know that having a strong position, an authentic position, and a position that you actually deliver on in relation to corporate social responsibility is a great way to attract and retain staff. The taxpayers and the public, if they think that money is being invested well through procurement, through partnerships, through actual investments, they are also going to view the sector more favourably, view the institution more favourably. And donors and alumni, clearly, the reputation of the institution and the people you do business with, you choose to do business with, can be affected by that. Regulators probably less so at the moment, but I suspect it won't be long before we start to see a bit more enthusiasm from regulators to look more closely at this. And I think there are already routes by which they could take action if they felt there was a serious problem around ESG issues in a university. So my sort of proposition to you is that sustainability already sits at the very heart of existing governance responsibilities. It is a very broad and evolving concept, and I thought Andrew's journey through 1987 onwards, how we've started to look more and more at these issues as a kind of coherent band of things that we should think about, means that now when you look at things like the obligation under your constitutional documents, I don't know how often you consult those, but your charter, your statutes or your instruments and articles of government, within that, the governing body has a responsibility to ensure that the assets of the university are used sustainably and to look after the long-term success of the institution. So if we take that broad obligation that was drafted in some cases hundreds of years ago, some cases more recently, it is easy to see how ESG should now sit squarely within thinking about the sustainability of the university. Certainly the university's own ESG responsibilities, but I would also argue the duty to ensure that it is promoted throughout the network of other organisations with whom the university interacts. Under charity law, all of you will be employed by institutions who are charities. Most of them will be exempt charities, but nonetheless, under that, the trustees of the charity, the governing body, have an obligation to ensure that the charity is sustainable and able to deliver its charitable objects in the long term and for the public benefit. And it's very easy to see how failing to, for example, ensure that the businesses that you spend money with are well run, are able to responsibly discharge their own obligations, could both affect the charity both financially, it's not a good deal that you got, but certainly reputationally. The damage that could be done if you've not done, a good check on who is it that you're choosing to spend your money with. The CUC Code of Governance, the latest iteration, which came out last year, has a lot to say about sustainability, about values, about the responsibility of the governing body for reputation, culture, values of the organisation. And again, I think if you apply the sort of idea of this being an evolving concept, it's very hard to imagine how you could discharge those obligations without thinking through environmental, social and corporate governance factors. I did say that I thought the regulatory framework was probably a very sort of slightly behind the curve on this. It's not quite on the forefront of ensuring that institutions discharge these obligations. But there are obviously, for those of you who are registered in England at any rate under the OFS regulatory framework, there are obviously registration conditions that relate to governance and management, and the idea that there's good governance and management for the long term and in a sustainable way. And there are the public interest governance principles, which include commitments around accountability, i.e. acting transparently with integrity in an ethical way, but also sustainability through proper risk management. So in extreme cases, and I must stress that it would have to be a very extreme case, in England, the OFS might be able to take action if it felt that an institution was, not taking seriously, certainly the corporate governance side of ESG. In Wales, there's a very interesting piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which imposes an obligation on public bodies, including universities, to think about the long-term impacts of their decisions and what it means for the kind of economic, social, environmental, and other sort of benefits or disbenefits it might offer future generations in the decisions they're taking today. So that's another route where regulation and law is trying to promote embracing ESG through the sort of day-to-day governance of an organisation. But ultimately, this is about culture, this is about values, and if you believe that governance matters, it matters just as much in promoting those softer things around culture and values as it does around the hard edge of budgeting, strategizing, and resource management. In terms of embedding ESG and why it's a positive thing, I mean, Andrew made the point that, there is a question mark over the cost of all this and is it delivering real value to the organisation? But I think if we move away from the strict cost benefit analysis that Andrew was rightly talking about, I think there are other reasons why adopting and embedding an ESG approach within the organisation, including in its procurement, will assist managing various risks. So the first and probably the most important is the reputational risk. We all know how easy it is these days to find oneself in the middle of a sort of Twitter storm or some other social media crisis, simply because somebody has uncovered that something that was, perhaps very innocently entered into links the university to some disreputable company or to some disreputable activity. So having an embedded approach to ESG ought to minimise the risk of those sort of hidden nasties suddenly appearing and creating real problems for the institution's reputation. I don't think, as I said, we should underestimate the student pressure that the institutions will come under to do more in this area. We know certainly in relation to the environment, there's a really, really strong pressure coming from students to do more, but equally social justice. As I say, corporate governance probably less important to them, but certainly those two things are important to recruitment. We know what a volatile recruitment market it is out there. What is it that's going to attract a student to your institution rather than to many others who may be offering essentially quite similar things? Things like a commitment to these values that these young people hold very dearly should help. Similarly, retaining them if they want to carry on studying postgraduate, etc. Why would they pick you? But I think softer things. So I'm sitting on a thing at the moment called the Student Futures Commission, which is looking at how do we support students, given prospective students and current students, given all they've gone through the pandemic. And the Commission has really seen very clearly the importance that everybody places, students place, on belonging to an institution and feeling proud of their institution in terms of making them want to stay and succeed and thrive. And I think, again, a strong commitment to ESG, given how it plays into their values, would help with these sort of student-facing issues as well. Compliance, Andrew mentioned a couple of them already, modern slavery, bribery, anti-bribery measures, even EDI, things like that. These are measures that, the public sector equality duty about promoting opportunity for diverse groups and so on, all of that can feed very well into a mature embedded ESG approach. It stops it being seen as just a compliance exercise, but something that is part and parcel of how a university does business. And lastly, strategic delivery. It will be, to my mind, impossible to find a single strategic plan that didn't include some commitment to obviously environmental performance, but also to supporting the local community, and also to the idea of good corporate governance. So I think, for all those reasons, governing bodies should not see ESG as something that's done narrowly just through a procurement arm, but something that flows through all of their responsibilities and will help them in these key risk areas. The interesting thing, I think, also is to look at how, to my mind, ESG is really of its time when you look at what the sector is kind of being asked to do or choosing to do for itself. So the first is, I sat on the Civic University Commission, which was looking at how universities supported the communities they served beyond providing high quality teaching and research and opportunities for students and staff to be employed by it. And it was quite clear that part of the civic mission would be around the sort of social issues that Andrew had on his first slide. So looking at how do we benefit the local community, how is the community experiencing the presence of the university as a force for good in its life. And if you are a part of an institution that has embraced the civic mission, that has, for example, signed up to a civic university agreement, ESG sits so squarely within that I think it'd be very easy to find routes to for governing bodies, for governance of the institution more widely, to sort of embrace ESG as part of the civic mission. Levelling up at the Conservative Party conference in Andrew's hometown of Manchester, we heard finally what government means by levelling up. And as you'll remember, they were really talking about four things. They were talking about improving the quality of local leadership. They were talking about improving public services. And then they were talking about two things which I think fit very squarely within the ESG approach. The first was improving standards of living. And that will be by procurement. So who do you spend money with? It will be by creating high quality jobs for people. It will be about supporting and promoting businesses that want to contribute to the locality for the long term in a sustainable way. And the final one was improving civic pride. And again, if we think about what ESG means, it creates organisations in whom we can have pride, in whom we can trust, and in whom we can, feel that the community is in safe hands. And I think there is also a question mark here about the whole debate around the value of universities. We know people are asking, well, what's the value of a university education? We know people are asking whether universities are the best place to invest research and innovation money, or could it be done elsewhere? But universities, if they embrace the ESG approach, could also demonstrate that they are in an almost unique position within communities to lead on all these areas through a very wide range of approaches. So to my mind, ESG, embracing it might well be the right thing to do right now for those reasons. And lastly, before I hand over to Udi, how do we go about doing this? How do we actually embed ESG into university governance? And what role might you, as from a procurement side, play in all this? The first is a simple question of board awareness. I do a lot of work with governing bodies, and I know that they spend an awful lot of their time poring over papers and detailed kind of decisions they have to make and accountabilities they have to tick off. But they are fascinated when you start thinking about these big questions. What is our role? What are we here to do? How do we do it differently and better and more impactfully? So I think, again, you know, a lot of them will know about this in their own working lives. They may never have thought about what the university specifically could do to drive this agenda forward. So board awareness might be a starting point. If we're serious about it, then again, we need to have very clear accountabilities at board level and below about who is going to do what differently to deliver on this agenda. As I've articulated, for me, it is aligned to the strategy, vision and purpose of just about any university I've ever worked with. If it isn't, how do we align it? How do we build it in so that it is just part and parcel of the things we do and how we do them every single day? Then you get into the usual stuff that you'd expect to see with any kind of embedding of an approach. You know, we need to know what our targets are. We need to report and monitor how we're doing against those targets, and we need to strive to continually improve them. But I think once you've got it onto the board agenda, it should be easy to track in the ways that they try to track all sorts of other initiatives in which they might be involved. So I'm very happy to take questions about any of that later, but for now I'm going to hand over to Udi.
Thank you very much, Smita. Let me see if I can. Does that work for everyone? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes, that's fine, Udi.
Perfect. I think if I give you just a very brief overview of my part of the presentation, having picked up on what Smita just described as the overall reasons for embedding and the how we embed ESG into governance, the next part of the question, or the flip side, taking into account that as a kind of the overall global position, is the very much the how and what. So what can we actually do in order to embed those policies into the very practical problem of providing social value and ensuring that in the procurement process. And this presentation will just look at these two key pieces of legislation and legislative guidance on social value in procurement. One's the Public Services Social Value Act of 2012, and the second is a procurement guidance policy note, which was published last year and is working its way in terms of its impact in the sector. So as I see it, once we've established social value as in a holistic way into the overall governance of the sector, what the next step then is to implement social value throughout the whole of the procurement project life cycle. What I've provided is a kind of if you like, a project life cycle, so that you can see how social value can be implemented using the tools that already exist in procurement law that you'll be familiar with, in order to introduce social value in a way which should be both familiar, should not be intimidating, but is often not fully taken advantage of in procurement processes. So at the beginning, designing or understanding social value objectives prior to the procurement, which might include, as Smita has described, collaborations with other organisations and other civic partners. The second stage is the design of a specific procurement. Having designed the procurement strategy for a particular procurement, you can use or consider social value in the selection of bidders that you want to enter into contracts or enter into partnerships with. Following that, you can use selection. So you can use the social value as part of the award and evaluation criteria, and then following that, having got into contract with your preferred contractor, you can use social value as part of the tools for ensuring social value. In this presentation, we'll just pick up on a couple of those points. So I'm not going to go through the whole of the project life cycle. I'll just focus on where we can apply the tools and legislation in the Public Services Social Value Act at stage 1, which is pre-procurement. I won't discuss the procurement design and selection criteria. These are points which both Andrew and Smita have discussed earlier. So, for instance, the use of, you can use things like social labels and designing processes to include SMEs and voluntary organisations. But then I will take the time to discuss a little bit more about how you use social value as part of the award and evaluation criteria in the light of the procurement policy note from last year. And again, I'll leave the section on contract conditions, which is a more tailored and more mandatory way of ensuring compliance for another session. The starting point for us is the Public Services Social Value Act, and under that there's a general obligation to consider social value. It's a lovely act, very short, and relatively very easy to comply and consider, but the issue about it is that often it's not really considered in the context of procurements, I find more generally. In order to provide a background or a framework to what the Public Services Social Value Act does, the key concepts are that the relevant authority, which is tied to a contracting authority under the public contracts regulations. Again, there's something of an issue within the HEI sector as to whether universities fall within or without the public contracts rules in order to for the application of the procurement rules. But that shouldn't hinder voluntarily using the legislation in order to consider the use of social value within a specific procurement. In fact, the very obligation itself is quite limited. The key point is here: it's the authority must consider what that means is that it doesn't need to do actually very much. It doesn't need to implement or take account of any social value as part of the procurement. It doesn't go really any further than it needs to consider, which means take some at least record some decision making which has an impact on social value in the context of the procurement. The procurement needs to take into account social value within the relevant area. That again is one of those issues which is a little bit of often a little bit of a puzzle for universities, which it's because universities can have different campuses and campuses which are within the UK and abroad, and sometimes even virtually. The legislation is clearly designed for things like local authorities, police authorities, which have got a very kind of close statutorily defined boundary and area, which does mean that there could be more of a puzzle because of the impact of what universities are doing and what they're looking for in terms of the benefit to themselves. The Public Services Social Value Act applies in terms of this obligation to consider applies in the context of procurement of services or services together with goods or works. Again, to feed back a little bit on Andrew's earlier comments, it is a little bit unusual in that what that says is that, so for instance, if you are going out to market for a catering services contract, then you are obliged to consider how that might improve the economic, social, environmental well-being of the area, including the procurement process. But if you are only applying, if you're only going out to market for particular goods, ingredients, so fruit and vegetables, then you do not need to consider those areas. It's almost as if the obligation to consider it was already seen as something as too much of an obligation for things like, for goods and for works. It does reflect something a little bit of a tension in that the procurement rules require that the measures that you consider need to be both relevant and proportionate to the specific procurement. But what we're really after, which is about the improvement of the relevant area, is something which is over and above the specific procurement itself. So it's not just the value to the university, which might be, what are the, for instance, what are the cheapest fruit and vegetables that you can get locally, and you might think of taking into account social considerations, including things like the environmental costs of transport, etc. But it's also to cover something which is wider than just the cost to the university, but also the cost more generally to the area in which the university operates. So there is a bit of a tension in terms of the legislation and navigating that within the context of procurement law to ensure that the measures are themselves appropriate and therefore lawful and not subject to challenge. following the coming into force of that act, there was a review in 2015, which did a number of things. The key starting point was that the definition of the application of the Public Services Act remained limited to services and was not widened to supplies and works. Under the procurement rules, there was a slightly higher value threshold for what are described as social and other services. So things like healthcare and education. The review insisted that the application of the Social Value Act remained at the lower value and not at the higher value that would otherwise apply to those kinds of services if they went out to procurement. And the review did not consider that it was worth making the obligation any tougher. So the obligation remains an obligation to consider, and it's not a more onerous obligation, such as an obligation to have regard to or to implement. What that means, I think, certainly from my practice experience, is that very little, I think, has been embedded in terms of general procurement processes. What I find happens is that where there is some mandatory legislation which has an impact on social value, such as the Bribery Act or the Modern Slavery Act, comes into force, which actually imposes a statutory obligation to ensure compliance within a supply chain as part of the purchasing process, that will get everyone's attention and be embedded straight away throughout the whole of the procurement process. But this obligation to consider, certainly more generally, and certainly in the last year, when I've been involved in a number of very, very large procurements, I don't see this becoming embedded as part of the procurement process, simply because it doesn't have sufficiently a priority amongst either the procurement community or consultants as part of the who are engaged in as part of the procurement of a particular project. And again, that's probably because that it's often seen as a nice to have and or a potential additional cost driver to the market. And that is something which I think is very, very clearly needs to change, and was proposed as part of the review, which looked at a number of areas of good practice. Areas of good practice included, firstly, designing procurements in order to include, which really meant not to exclude, smaller businesses, include social outcomes as part of a overall project specification, use the social value criteria as part of the award criteria and not just at the selection stage, and core contract management. The review referred to a number of points which are these are the most problematic. The problematic area of how do you ensure social values taken into account as part of the procurement, but you still remain on the right side of this tension between ensuring that you want to have the benefit of taking advantage of good evaluation criteria, which will select a good partner from a social value perspective, but also ensuring that you are not subject to challenge from a third party who will say that this is not a relevant criterion, therefore I'm looking to challenge the award of the contract. The measurement framework used a couple of different measures which tried to explain how you square that circle. The first was using a purely financial model, so using a measure called the social return on investment. What that does is to try and to convert the social benefits into a financial value, and you can measure that value and take that into account as part of the overall evaluation, and you just run that as if it's a financial value, as you would with price or some other straightforward numerical metric. You apply the algorithm and that number should come out. The other approach is to use a similar proxy, which is, for instance, the social value portal, which does something similar. It scores, you score points or pounds for how much social value activity is proposed. The issues are, of course, there's no kind of overall, there's no consistent model for each of those. So that does take a little bit of invention. And the issue with using a financial measure is that it's very difficult for a financial measure to really provide the best proxy for something which has got not purely a financial benefit. So there are other externalities which show benefits to the environment, which are not covered by the either purely a cost saving or a kind of a proposed cost differential. So in the light of that, last year, over the last couple of years, was a government proposed and last year published a procurement policy note 0620 on social value in central government contracts. So this applies from 2010-20 to what are described as in-scope organisations. So it might not have come across your radar as it applies to central government and not to universities, but it is helpful in giving you an idea of the kinds of mechanics that government proposes in order to provide procurement professionals with assistance on how to take social value into account in the evaluation and award criteria. The policy note considers these 5 core overarching themes: COVID-19 recovery, tackling economic inequality, fighting climate change, equal opportunity and well-being. I'll provide a description later on in the presentation for you later. The key points are that this provides the guidance provides that the evaluation criteria must include social value as a minimum as 10% of the overall score, and the guidance itself provides both the model evaluation questions and guidance for tenderers, as well as the criteria and reporting metrics. So here's an example, which is, I'll say it's meant to be intentionally off-putting. That's why I put it on there. But you can see that what they are trying to do is provide procurement professionals with a toolkit in order to be able to apply these 5 overarching social value criteria as part of any procurement. It has at the one end, it has the evaluation questions, followed by the model award criteria, the guidance for the evaluators, and it has a number of the reporting metrics. I have a number of these on the slide handout. I won't go through them now, but I suppose I'll go through a number of what I think are the key points and issues to think about in terms of how the procurement policy guidance works. The first is the issue of having 10% weighting. It's not mandatory, but so you can certainly use that you can weight social value more. The bigger problem is a conceptual one. If you have 10% or 20% or any as part of the social value criteria, you still have the issue of how does that apply in the context of your procurement as a whole. So even if you have 10% weighting, that doesn't prevent a bidder who will tender for something which is either lower quality but lower price, but can see that the if the weightings are 50-50 price and non-price, but can still, using the mechanics, apply a lower price and have, even if they have a zero, recognize that even if I have a zero score for social value, can still win the procurement. While that allows we think of that as kind of gaming the system, but the suppliers will just think that this is how you've defined what you want. So if you want something with that 10% balance, or with any balance, you need to consider whether you should have either higher or whether there should be a mandatory element to social value as part of the procurement process. The second issue which comes out throughout all of this is that the evaluation questions tend by and large to impose additional burdens on SMEs, and the reason for that is because of the sheer number and the detail of the questions that are in this guidance. It tends to favour those bidders who are experts in writing bids rather than in providing the products. And the questions certainly around economic growth are all tied and are relevant for prime contractors in working in that typical supply chain route, rather than being directed to local small and medium-sized enterprises. A third I think, which I think is one of the main issues, is whether the reporting metrics themselves are appropriate. So some of the metrics don't clearly of themselves reflect or create social values. Some of them just refer to the number of contracts or the number of acts. So I think the policy note is certainly a helpful point to as a starting point for embedding social value as part of the evaluation element of the procurement project cycle, but not necessarily the whole of the answer, which, as I said right at the beginning, is something which should be embedded right across the whole of the project cycle. For more on the Social Value Act and the Procurement Policy Note, I've got resources at the end of my presentation.
Okay, Udi, thank you so much. That was it's a huge area to try and get through in an hour, so I think we have been a little bit too ambitious, but hopefully it's given people a good flavour of what it's all about, what it looks like, and how you can implement it within your organisations. I am conscious of time, and I know we have lost a few, but I have got some questions through that hopefully we can just quickly run through. So Rob Logan has asked the question about the balance between sustainable procurement and social value, and that it's harder to measure the social value in some ways. So so I don't know if anyone would like to answer that question. How do you strike that balance between sustainability and social value, and how do you measure it in a robust, tangible way? Anybody?
Yeah, I think it's developing. I think the whole social value agenda is newer than the sort of environmental sustainability. So we're starting to develop how we measure it. We haven't got the solution yet. We're tracking it in some ways, but we haven't got a robust reporting mechanism yet, or measurement mechanism.
So, and then another question there from Rob.
Sorry,
sorry.
I suppose I was just going to add, just to follow on from the note on the procurement policy note from last year. There's one of the sections in the themes is on environmental stewardship as part of the fighting climate change. They have a metric. It's all proxies. I think that's probably all the best that we can offer, is that there are proxies from social value, in terms of converting something that you think is a good metric for sustainability, which could be an purely environmental one, the number of, I don't know, the green spaces created, or the your carbon footprint measures, or something like that, and take that as part of the metric. Though they have problems, I absolutely can't dispute that, but not least because there's no absolutely consistent way of measuring them across any of the labels or any of the different schemes that there are. But the key is to just apply something which you think you can, if you like,
hang your hat on.
No, I think when I talk to procurement professionals, we use the language of, is this a defensible position?
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is perfect, but is this defensible?
Yeah. Thank you, Udi. And then following on there from Rob, what's the panel's view on value-based preferences? So, for example, not illegal, but low labour standards, because this is an area that is particularly important to our student community. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I saw that question come in. It's really difficult one to answer. I think I think government probably sets the minimum standard for the society through the laws, and we have to comply with the laws. But then above that, each organisation or each person has their own values, and they build up to create organisational values, which I think goes back to one of my final points in my presentation, is you have to know what your own values are and then apply them, and then not be too worried what other people think if you believe in your values. We pay them the living wage rather than minimum wage. And that was an easy decision for us to make as an executive group.
Can I just add a quick example to that? I remember years ago that one university had moved to paying the living wage, but because of the way it had contracted its cleaning services, it meant that the sort of gap between what it had done through procuring those services, where it had pushed the pricing down as low as possible, and what it was then paying its own staff, was so stark that clearly it was you couldn't defend the procurement decision at that point. So I would say it's all about values, but I do recognise there is a bottom line to think about as well. So.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question. So do you think that ESG is another way of describing responsible procurement, or do you see ESG as having a wider cross-organisational focus? How are measuring ESG progress and success over time to illustrate that your work is contributing to your team's progress, breathe, and wider university strategic objectives. So
I think, yeah, my view here is that ESG is a much wider agenda than responsible procurement, but responsible procurement has its part to play in contributing to that wider agenda in lots of different ways. Measuring progress is interesting. It's something we're developing all the time, and we don't have the perfect solution. We measure it in different ways. Different parts of the contribution from procurement are parts of different reports, whether it's a governance report or an environmental report.
thank you. Okay, any final comments from our speakers before we wrap up? So I would like to thank you all for your time and for supporting the event today. I think it's opened up lots of areas for further consideration, so hopefully we can pick up more focused discussion sessions in the future, so we can really deep dive into these areas. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for our delegates for attending and for the admin team for organising this. And we will get the slides out to you. We will give you a link to the recording. And if there is anything else that you would like to see in the future, please do let your relevant consortia know, and we will do our very best to get something sorted for you. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.